Today, we're going to get into a really foundational idea in legal philosophy, and that's H.L.A. Hart's concept of law. It's this incredible theory that doesn't just ask what the law is, but it kind of pulls back the curtain on the engine that makes a whole legal system actually run.
I mean, really think about it for a sec. When someone says, hey, that's the law, what actually gives that statement any power? What makes a rule from Parliament different from a rule your parents made up? This is the core question that Hart wanted to figure out. And the guy who really tackled this head-on was H.L.A. Hart, a British legal philosopher. His book from 1961, The Concept of Law, just completely changed the game. He looked at the old answers and thought, nope, that's not good enough, and he came up with something totally new.
See, before Hart came along, a really popular idea from guys like John Austin was that law is basically just a command from a boss, a sovereign, backed up by a threat. You know, do this or else. But Hart said, hold on, that's way too simple. He argued that a real legal system is something much more elegant, a union of primary and secondary rules.
So to get what he's talking about, Hart wants us to do a little thought experiment. Imagine a really simple society, one that only has one kind of rule. Let's see what that world would actually look like, and more importantly, why it would be riddled with problems. Hart calls this first type of rule primary rules. And an easy way to think about these is they're the basic do's and don'ts of a society, right? They're the rules that tell us how to act, what we have to do, and what we definitely can't do. And we're all super familiar with these. Don't steal. That's a primary rule. Don't commit murder. Pay your taxes. All primary rules. They govern our actions directly. Pretty straightforward so far.
But here is the million-dollar question that Hart asks. If a society only has these basic do's and don'ts, can we really call that a mature, functioning legal system? And Hart's answer is a big, resounding no. He says a society like that would have some major, crippling flaws.
He points out three huge problems. First, uncertainty. How would you know for sure what the rules even are? If I just declare a new rule, is it real? Who says? Second, the rules would be totally static. Society is always changing, but the rules would be frozen in time with no way to adapt. And third, inefficiency. Let's say you and I disagree about whether a rule was broken. Who settles it? There's no official referee. It's just chaos. So how do you fix this mess? How do you solve for uncertainty, a static nature, and total inefficiency? Well, this is where Hart's theory gets really brilliant. He introduces a whole other category of rules, designed specifically to fix these problems. He calls these secondary rules, and here's the key thing to get. They don't tell us how to behave. They aren't about our actions at all. Instead, they are rules about the primary rules. They're like the system's operating software, the instruction manual for all those do's and don'ts. Okay, so the first and maybe the most important secondary rule is the rule of recognition. This is the master rule that fixes that uncertainty problem. So how do you know a new bill is a real law? Because the Constitution sets out the procedure, right? The rule of recognition is that ultimate checkpoint. It's the shared agreement among officials about what counts as a valid law in their system. Next up, to fix that problem of a static, unchanging system, you need rules of change. These are the rules that give specific people or groups, like a legislator, the actual power to create new primary rules, change old ones, or just get rid of them completely. This is what keeps the law alive and breathing. And finally, to fix that inefficiency, you have rules of adjudication. These rules give certain people, like judges, the authority to have the final say on whether a primary rule has been broken. They create courts and all the procedures for settling arguments once and for all. So what we've got are two different kinds of rules. Primary rules for our behavior and secondary rules for managing those primary rules. And according to Hart, it's the union of these two, putting them together, that marks the giant leap from just a bunch of social customs to a real grown-up legal system. And this is where it all just clicks into place so perfectly. Every single one of those defects we talked about in that simple society has a specific secondary rule that acts as the cure. The problem of uncertainty, solved by the rule of recognition. The static nature, solved by the rules of change. And inefficiency, boom, solved by the rules of adjudication. It's just a beautiful interlocking system. This quote just nails the whole idea. On their own, primary rules are just a random list of commands. But when you add secondary rules, you get the framework, the authority, the whole instruction manual that turns that list into a functioning, coherent system of law.
Okay, so this is a really neat theory, right? But why does it actually matter? What does this tell us about law in the real world? Well, it turns out it tells us a ton.
What Hart's theory really does is it upgrades our whole understanding of what law is. It's not just a big guy with a stick telling people what to do. It's a complex social practice. It's a system built on a shared acceptance of rules by the officials who run it. It's about recognized authority, not just brute force. We can actually boil down why this is so important into 4 key takeaways. Hart's theory gives us the tools to see law as an interconnected system, to make a really important separation between law and morality, to understand how laws evolve, and maybe, coolest of all, to analyze pretty much any legal system out there.
Now, this point about separating law and morality, it's really crucial and sometimes a little uncomfortable. Hart is saying that a law is valid if it passes the test of the rule of recognition, not whether it's a good or moral law. Take the awful apartheid laws in South Africa. They were profoundly immoral, but under that system's rules, they were legally valid. This framework allows us to analyze an unjust system for what it is, without having to pretend it's not law.
And because this whole framework is so abstract, it's like a universal toolkit. You can use it to look at any society and figure out how it works. You can ask, okay, what's the rule of recognition in the United States? What is it in North Korea? Who gets to change the rules here? How do they settle disputes? It lets you compare any system, from democracies to authoritarian regimes.
And all of this brings us to one last big, lingering question. Hart gives us this powerful tool to identify what counts as a valid law. But if a law is technically valid according to the system, but it's also deeply, profoundly unjust, do we have a moral duty to obey it? That's the question Hart's theory makes us face, but it's one he doesn't answer for us. That's where the philosophy of law ends, and our own conscience has to begin.